He was a king who traded his brother's life for a crown and his city's soul for a lie. This is the chilling descent of King Lathas, the architect of a kingdom's greatest betrayal. History is often written by those who survive, but in the city of Ardougne, history was forged by a man who was determined to be the only one left standing. To the traveller approaching from the east, Ardouin appears to be a sprawling monument to Saradominus stability. Its markets are the heart of Gilinor's trade. Its paladins are the shields of the faithful. But there is a line drawn through the centre of the city, a wall of cold limestone that separates the prosperous from the forgotten. For years, we were told this wall was a mercy. We were told it was the only thing standing between the civilized world and a horrific, uncontainable plague. But as the fog of time clears, we find that the plague was never the true threat. The sickness didn't live in the blood of the poor. It lived in the mind of the man who sat upon the throne. Today, we look into the descent of King Lethus, of the house of Ardougne. We will trace his lineage from the dark days of the Fourth Age to the moment he was found, cowering in a wardrobe, watching his world of lies collapse around him. This is not just a story of a bad king. It is a story of how an elder brother's resentment turned a city of light into a kingdom of unspeakable atrocities. To understand Lathas, we must look further back than the wall. We have to look at the land itself. According to the ancient records, the site that would become Ardouin was originally a crossroads of tragedy. During the Fourth Age, this territory was the frontier of the Elven Empire of Baxtorian. King Baxtorian, the Elven monarch, ruled over the vast empire. However, due to a conflict with humans and a betrayal of his own kin, Baxtorian's wife, Glariel, went missing. Devastated by the loss of Glariel, and seeing his empire crumbling under the pressure of human expansion and internal strife, Baxtorian led a mass exodus of his people. And so the elves retreated, leaving behind their highly developed elven cities and resource-rich lands of the River Doin, everything abandoned. What followed was not a peaceful transition. There was no centralized power left to govern, and so the region was seized by some of the most dangerous forces Gilinor has ever known, the Majorat. An ancient, powerful race of skeletal shapeshifters, near immortals with slowly decaying life force. This only rejuvenated by sacrificial ritual. A story worth telling, but for another time. For centuries, the lands around River Doin were a playground for these Zamorakian generals. Haziel and Khazad established great influence here, with Haziel becoming the absolute ruler of this region for some time. His presence meant that this place was not a city, but a site of dark rituals and iron-fisted tyranny. The foundations of the city that we see today are literally built upon the ruins of Zamorakian cults. It wasn't until year 7 of the Fifth Age that a group of humans led by the Carnelian family rose up and reclaimed the land. The Carnelians were of noble blood, a family who refused to live as prey to the Majorat. They couldn't kill Majorat Haziel, so they did the only thing that they could. They sealed him beneath the earth. Utilizing ancient wards likely derived from Saradominus or early druidic influences, they managed to anchor Haziel in his subterranean chamber. This tomb remains beneath the very ground where the Ardouin market stands today. This is the psychological DNA of Ardouin. It is a city founded on the idea of sealing things away. If there's a problem, you bury it. If there's a threat, you build a wall around it. This was the environment that shaped the house of Ardougne. By the time Lathas' father, King Lethus, took the throne, the city had become a hub of trade. But the old shadows remained, the dreaded years of tragedy, between year 95 and 98, saw the city's water supply poisoned by terrorists, causing the very boils and skin irritations that Lathas would later replicate in his great hoax. Lathas didn't invent his lies from thin air. He studied the city's darkest chapters and learned how to weaponize its trauma. Lathas was the elder son. In any other kingdom, this would have been a simple path to power. but Lethus grew up in the shadow of his younger brother, Tyrus. They embodied the idea of the scroll and the sword. Lethus was the administrator. He was cold, analytical, and obsessed with the law. He understood the mathematics of power, how many guards it took to keep a street quiet, how much tax a merchant could bear before they broke. Tyrus, however, was the sword. He was the hero. He spent his days in the training yards with the knights, and his nights in the tavern with the people. The citizens of Ardougne didn't just obey Tyrus, they loved him. And to a man like Lathas, who seemed to only aspire obedience through fear and law, that love was a personal insult. The breaking point came in year 136. King Lethus, perhaps sensing a friction between his sons, made a decision that would ultimately destroy his lineage. He divided the kingdom. King Lethus feared that if Lathas took total control, Tyrus's popularity would lead to a civil war. Conversely, he feared that if Tyrus ruled, the administrative complexity of the East would collapse. He chose a middle path that inadvertently doomed the Ardougne line. He promised East Ardougne, the seat of wealth, the palace and the markets, to Lathas. He promised West Ardougne, the industrial docks and the rugged western frontier, to Tyrus. For the public, it was a move towards stability. For Lathas, it was a declaration of war. He saw the division not as an inheritance, but as a theft. He believed the entire city belonged to the elder son by right of blood. Soon after, an accident occurred. King Lethus was taken by a rogue arrow during a hunting expedition, and so the two princes became kings. I picture Lathas standing on the balcony of the east, watching his brother's coronation in the west, and realizing that as long as Tyrus was loved, he would always be a half-king. This narrative is later confirmed during quest dialogue. Lathas quoted saying,
"My brother was never meant to rule. The kingdom was mine by birthright. My father chose to give him half the kingdom, and he did a terrible job ruling it."
A curious thing about the king's death, this listed as an unfortunate accident. Every bit of dialogue the adventurer encounters, there is no mention of anyone credited with seeing the king fall. The narrative consistently presents the death as a discovery of a body, rather than a witnessed event. This is convenient for Lathas. The accident classification prevents the involvement of outside forces, such as the Temple of Ardougne. And with Lathas acting as the kingdom's sole administrator, he is in a position to hide what he doesn't want others to find. It begs the question, did Lathas have his father killed? A reach, perhaps, but a possibility, absolutely. Then came the Great Western Expedition to the Elven lands of Ardougne, the largest military and exploratory undertaking in the history of the Fifth Age. When Tyrus announced his great expedition, the world saw a hero seeking to reclaim lost lands. Lathas, however, saw a vacancy. Lathas funded the expedition. He opened the royal vaults and gave Tyrus everything he asked for: weapons, supplies, and the finest knights in the realm. To the observers at the time, it looked like a gesture of brotherly support. In reality, Lathas was paying for his brother's exile. He was draining the West of its military elite, leaving the common people without their protector. As the expedition disappeared over the horizon, Lathas began his work. We now know that Tyrus reached the Elven lands, but found himself trapped behind the underground pass. The powerful sorcerer and self-proclaimed son of Zamorak, Ardouin, had risen again, turning the pass into a death trap. Lathas knew this. His scouts had reported the corruption of the tunnels, but he didn't send a rescue party. He didn't warn people. He allowed Ardouin to act as his proxy jailer. While Tyrus was fighting for survival in the dark, Lathas was rebranding his brother as a lost soul or a deserter. He controlled the flow of information so perfectly that the people of Ardougne began to forget the man they once loved. During this period of isolation, another threat was apparent to Lathas to the east: Camelot. King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table were given a castle by Lathas's father, alongside a wealthy nobleman, Lord Sinclair, a move which Lathas believed left the kingdom physically diminished. They represented a form of power that Lathas couldn't quantify. Leadership based on chivalry and shared honour. As the legends of Arthur's knights began to spread through Kandarin, Lathas felt the walls closing in. Lathas truly despised King Arthur and his knights. In his eyes, Arthur was merely a foreigner who had been granted land by his sentimental father. He felt inadequate. He was a king of bureaucrats and tax collectors, while Arthur was a king of heroes. This insecurity is likely what drove Lathas into the arms of the Iorwerth clan, a militaristic faction of the elven race who abandoned traditional elven pacifism in favour of dark magic. These dark elves of the Iorwerth didn't talk about honour, they talked about results. They offered Lathas an eternal breath, the promise of a crystalline immortality that would allow him to outlive his brother, his enemies, and even time itself. The price was simple. He had to become a puppet of their interests. He had to provide the human labour and the logistical cover they needed to summon the Dark Lord. See, some time ago, Lathas had grown tired with his lord Saradomin, feeling his prayers were not listened to, and so he turned to Zamorak, who he believed to be the Dark Lord. Quoted near the end of his life, Lathas said,
I prayed to Saradomin that he would help unite my kingdom again. He chose not to reply. I turned to the Dark Lord instead.
However, this reality was not the truth. The Iorwerth clan intended to raise a different darkness, not Zamorak, but another god entirely, perhaps a story for another time. Unaware of this reality, Lathas did not hesitate. He traded the souls of his subjects for a throne that would never rot. And so, as time went on, the most infamous lie in Gillinor's history was born. Lathas didn't just build the Great Wall of Ardougne, he built a narrative of fear. He needed to justify the sealing of the West so that the Iorwerth could excavate an ancient temple beneath its ground. The Temple of Light was the key to summoning the Dark Lord, originally built by a god to be used as a prison to contain this darkness. In their mind, unrestricted access to West Ardougne and the citizens was crucial, no matter the cost. Using elven reagents, Lathas caused localized outbreaks of skin irritation among the poor in West Ardougne. He dyed sheep to look diseased and poisoned grain supplies to ensure that people felt the physical reality of a plague. This wall, it served as a psychological barrier. It turned his brother's subjects into the infected. It turned the West into a laboratory. Lathas then introduced the Mourners. Officially, they were healers. In reality, they were Iorwerth death guards hidden behind masks. They didn't tend to the sick, they rounded up the healthy. They suppressed dissent. They ensured that anybody who questioned the plague was quarantined, a euphemism for being sent into the slave pits beneath the city to work on the Temple of Light. By the year 169, Lathas was ready for the final act. This was the moment the Iorwerth clan's excavation of the Temple of Light reached a critical phase. They needed the Death Altar, found within the temple, powered, but they feared that if Tyrus ever managed to lead his veteran knights back through the underground pass, the military sword would shatter the Mourner occupation. Lathas realized that for the new order to be permanent, the old king had to be erased. He needed Tyrus dead, but he couldn't do it himself. He needed a pawn. And this is where you, the adventurer, enters the story. Lathas paints a picture of a mad king in the West, a Tyrus who had been corrupted by the Dark Lord and was preparing to invade Ardougne with an army of shadows. He convinced you, the adventurer, that killing Tyrus was a mercy to the world. He provided the adventurer with a toxic bomb. This weapon was a cruel touch of irony. It released a purple gas that mirrored the symptoms of the fake plague Lathas had used to divide the city. When Tyrus was assassinated in his camp in Isafdar, he died in the very miasma of lies his brother had created, a disturbing yet poetic piece of RuneScape history. Lathas didn't mourn. He sat in his chambers, looking west, and finally felt like a whole king. He believed he had erased the sword. He believed the scroll was now the only law in Kandarin. But lies have a way of unraveling. The downfall of Lathas didn't come from a grand army, it came from a scientist named Elena, and a father named Edmund, residents of Ardougne. As a scientist and a medical researcher, Elena did not accept the plague out of fear like her fellow citizens, but instead she applied a clinical methodology to the outbreaks. She travelled to West Ardougne and found samples she intended to use to diagnose the plague, but as she tried to leave, she was kidnapped. She was getting too close to the truth, and so the mourners locked her in a house in West Ardougne. Her disappearance was framed as a quarantine measure. Desperate to find his kidnapped daughter, Edmund spent months digging a secret tunnel, from his garden in the east, under the Great Wall, and into the sewers of the west. This tunnel was the first physical breach of Lathas's impenetrable barrier. The first real sign of physical resistance, an action that eventually became something much more severe. And so the adventurer braved the mourner-infested so-called plagued city, and smuggled Elena out. Against all odds, she uncovered the truth. She found that the samples Lethus was using to prove the plague were fraudulent. She began to spread the word of a fake plague, and soon word made it back to the royal castle. King Lathas had her imprisoned in the castle dungeon, only to be saved later by a familiar adventurer, this time disguised as an Ardouin knight. This brings me to the Ardouin Revolution. What began as a whisper in the slums ended as a roar at the palace gates. The revolution was not a gradual political shift, but a sudden, explosive insurrection. Following the revelations that the plague was a total fabrication, a coalition of West Ardouin citizens, former soldiers, and the resistance led by Elena and her allies launched a direct assault on the royal palace. These revolutionaries used the very tunnels Edmund had pioneered and the chaos of the collapsing quarantine to swarm the castle. The resistance was met at the castle gates by knights and paladins. However, these guards were outnumbered, leaving Lathas vulnerable. When the wall finally fell, it wasn't just stone that collapsed, it was the entire Ardougne reality. The most telling detail of Lathas's character is his end. He didn't meet the rebels with a sword. He didn't offer a grand defense of his necessary evils. He hid. He was found cowering in a wardrobe in the royal quarters. The man who had presided over the suffering of thousands, who had ordered the death of his own brother, and who had conspired with dark gods, was reduced to a small, shivering figure among his own silk robes. He was taken to the Ardouin market, the very heart of the city his family had ruled for generations. In the shadow of the palace, the law he had manipulated for so long finally demanded its price. He was executed, not as a king, but as a traitor, to the very blood he claimed to protect. His final words being,
"In the name of Zamorak, I curse you, each and every one of you."
King Lathas is gone, but the city he broke is still healing. The plague is no more, but the economic divide between East and West Ardougne remains a permanent scar. His cousin Thoros now sits on the throne, ruling a kingdom that no longer trusts its own crown. Lathas's descent is a warning. It shows us that the most dangerous walls aren't the ones made of stone, but the ones built out of our own insecurities. He was a man who couldn't handle being second, a man who loved the idea of kingdom more than the people within it. And in the end, he wasn't a hero, and he wasn't a god. He was just a brother who couldn't share. And for that, a city bled for a decade. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the lore of the House of Ardougne. If you enjoyed this journey into Gillinor's darker history, consider subscribing for more lore-focused stories. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon and your heart guarded against the whispers of the Ire Worth.